Well, maybe we'll get things started then. Thank all of you for coming to hear this presentation this morning. And I especially want to thank Tim Graber and John Epp, Leroy Epp, and Austin Unruh from North Church for coming to share about their father's experiences in being a consciousness objector. And Laverne Graber is also going to share with us this morning. And if there's time, I don't know if there will be, most of you are aware of the fact that my grandfather was a consciousness objector during World War I. I've told that story at other times, so I don't know if I will probably not do that this morning. But I asked Gail Preheim if he could be here this morning. Well, he's not here, but he gave me a written account of his experiences in 1966 during the Vietnam War. Gail spent 3 years in a service program in Vietnam right during the height of the war there. And so I will take time to read his account. So we're going to start this morning with Tim and then John telling about their father's experiences. Tim's dad was in CPS during World War II, and John's dad was in military service in Africa? In Africa. So let's begin. Tim.
Could I adjust this thing? Yeah, okay. CPS, or Civilian Public Service, was an alternate service option to serving in the military, which my dad took part in. My father, W. Jim Graber, he was in CPS for approximately 3.5 years in the early 40s. Dad had 2 older brothers, Silas and Waldo, who were not required to serve just because of their age and the time of life they were. There was no war going at that time. He also had a younger brother, Pete, who received an exemption from military service or from alternative service. The exemption was to take care of his parents and the farm at that time. I remember my father saying he was very glad the government provided an alternative option, because he said the thought of being trained by the military to shoot and kill fellow human beings was unthinkable. In light of his Anabaptist upbringing and Christian education, being part of the military was against his and his family's beliefs. Dad modeled the Anabaptist example of non-resistance, and yet he influenced me a lot when he taught me how to handle guns when we went hunting, and all the good times that we had when we went hunting. But there were times when, at those times, he talked about the military and how that was just plain wrong. My father began his CPS service in Weeping Water, Nebraska, and he described planting trees and shelter belts for conservation purposes there. He fondly talked about his friendships with the other volunteers from Illinois, Nebraska, and Iowa, many of whom were from the old Mennonite tradition. Some, including my father, were transferred at some point to Lincoln, Nebraska to continue their service there. At that place, Dad worked with hogs and chickens in experimental stations, which were connected with the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. He was especially interested in comparing different kinds of breeds of pigs, namely Yorkshires, Hampshires, and Durocs, and he would run the performance trials, or he assisted with that. This piqued his interest in Durocs because he said they were the most efficient in terms of amount of pounds of feed consumed and amounts of pounds of pork produced. So when he got back, he was really fired up, he said, and couldn't wait to acquire some Durocs and began selling Duroc breeding stock at that time. Dad was also in charge of feeding and caring for flocks of chickens. My mother tells this story that Dad had a large appetite, liked to eat, and sometimes there wasn't enough food in his group. So since he was taking care of the chickens, he would sneak a raw egg once in a while and have a snack. It was important at that time as a CPS worker not to show up in the evenings in public places, especially if you were not in uniform or otherwise connected to the military, because of the perception that you were dodging your patriotic duty. And he said there were times when they did go out, this all comes from my mother, and they left because of the jeering and the bad things that were said about them being chicken and yellow and not being part of the military. The CPS volunteers were paid a whole $15 a month. Dad moonlighted at the Gooch Pasta Factory in Lincoln, Nebraska, for extra spending money, and that was during nights. He worked nights to make some extra money. And after that, he could never eat pasta. He said the smell and the exposure to that process was enough to turn his stomach. He did not like pasta ever after that. He, along with two other friends, purchased an Indian motorcycle for transportation. Every third weekend, Dad was able to drive the motorcycle home here for a brief visit to visit his family. And it's one example of the camaraderie that Dad enjoyed with his fellow volunteers there. He viewed his CPS experience positively. Sharon and I remember many visits from friends that he made there, which were lifelong relationships, and they would come and visit to see what was going on in South Dakota. Sharon said when these friends would visit, it was her first exposure to different Mennonite names, like Schrock. She thought that should be Shrog. They must have mispronounced it, but it was Schrock. They were of the old Mennonite background. Dad met Mother on a blind date while he was at Lincoln. Mom was in nursing school, and her roommate, Ruthie, was a Mennonite. And Ruthie had many good things to say about these Mennonites. They're good people, she said. Somehow Ruthie was part of setting up the blind date between Mom and Dad. When Dad entered the CPS program, he had no idea how long his term would be. And no one knew how long the war would last. And this caused a lot of anxiety. He said, and I remember him saying, we thought this war could last for 10 years. And what would we do here for 10 years? But it did end. I think Dad learned a lot about many things, including the importance of relationships with people that he worked alongside with every day. And to cap it off, he brought home a wife who willingly adopted the Mennonite faith and became a vital part of our church and this community, and I guess still is.
I am John Epp, and I'm speaking for my father, Walter Epp, for the first half of my presentation. I relied on my oldest brother, Arlen, to make sure, hopefully, the information is correct. For my father's part, there were two questions. What was the decision made concerning the draft, and how was the church influential in this decision? I can answer the first one. I was not around for the Bethel Church's response for the other one, but I take it they were family. In my growing up years, I never heard anything negative about it. When Dad's number was called, he enlisted and went to basic training. He went through basic training 3 times because they, the Army, didn't have a place to send him yet. He realized they were waiting to send him to the front in Europe. This he did not want to do, so he signed up for flight school. He was sent to Texas, and after finishing flight school, he was stationed in Casablanca, and he flew supplies from Casablanca to Cairo, Egypt. When the war ended, he flew troops that were from the Far East, from Cairo to Casablanca, so they could get home. Upon returning home, he started teaching Sunday school, and through pastors that did terms at the Bethel Church, became very influential in him changing his position. He questioned the military motto, "Do or die." The three pastors were Harris Kaufman, Harold Thiessen, and Ralph Graber. During Ralph Graber's pastorate, he was teacher of the 7th and 8th graders, which my oldest brother Arlen was in his class. Ralph made them read 3 books: Smith's Story of the Mennonites, War and Peace and Non-Resistance by Gott Hirschberger, and J.C. Winger's book, Introduction to Theology. Dad also read these books and others that Arlen used at FJC and at Bethel College for participation in peace clubs. These solidified Dad's peace stance. And in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, he participated in civil rights demonstrations and anti-war demonstrations in Sioux Falls. Have decisions you made or those of the past generations influenced your life? Decisions made by my parents definitely affected decision-making for myself. The draft was canceled by the time I was 18, but I still had to register. At that time, I believe Mike Bogart and through Swan Lake Camp, they had classes on registering CO. I attended these classes and sent a faith statement along with my registration of being CO. The other question, where do we see God leading us as a church in the future regarding the peace position? When my dad was in his late 80s or early 90s, he was asked if he regretted his decision. His reply, he didn't know because he didn't know any different. He didn't regret it because he didn't know any different. I asked my children if they had any in-depth study of peacemaking in Sunday school or at the academy. The older ones said, in Sunday school, Steve Graber did some study on it, and at the academy, Dennis Schrock had them study peacemaking. The younger ones said they didn't. That leaves me with the question, so if our church doesn't teach it and our church's school don't teach it, how will it continue?
In the 1950s, there was a mandatory draft. All male 18-year-olds had to register with the Selective Service. It was post-Korean War and pre-Vietnam War. Everyone got a 1A classification, which was combat duty. There was a choice of 1AO for non-combat duties. For conscientious objectors to war, they had to apply to the local county draft board. In the winter of 1956, my parents and I were invited to the Harry Kaufman home. Larry Eisenbeis had just returned from 2 years PAC service in Greece. I had been thinking about doing my service with PAX, a Latin word for peace. I had an adventurous spirit probably because I led a sheltered life. After visiting with Larry, I knew I wanted to do PAC service. To get my 1W classification, which is CO, I had to go to the county draft board. I went to the Hutchinson County Selective Service Office and spoke to the draft board chairman. I stated my reasons for being a CO and that I wanted to do a 2-year foreign service. He said the board was meeting the next week and I should appear and state my case. I was attending FJC and the choir was going on a 2-week tour to the West Coast. I said I would not be able to attend. He said they would consider my request. The Hutchinson County Draft Board was known to be unfriendly toward COs. The men from Turner County got their classifications seemingly without much trouble. When Hutchinson County guys were refused their classification, Dr. John D. Unruh became their advocate in appealing to the state draft board. When I returned from the choir tour, to my surprise, my 1W classification was in the mail. To my knowledge, I was the first person to get a 1W classification in Hutchinson County. I probably got it because I wanted to do foreign service. I notified MCC Akron that I wanted to do PAC service. I asked to go to Germany. They were building houses for World War II refugees at that time. PAC was a 2-year service, foreign service. Only single males were eligible and a $75 a month was suggested to be paid by either my family or their church. PAC's program started in 1951 and ended 25 later in 1976. There were units in Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. About 1,200 served in the PACs in those years. It was a hot July afternoon shelling ear corn when my mom came and said there was a long-distance phone call for me. Long-distance phone calls were rare in those days, but it was the MCC Akron asking if I wanted to go to Paraguay to build roads. I wasn't sure where Paraguay was. MCC gave the names of 5 other guys, and I had one week to decide. I would probably leave in 6 weeks. And one of those guys was John Hubert from Henderson, Nebraska. I knew him from Swan Lake Christian Camp. I called him and he said he was going, and so my decision was easy to go. In the last week of August, we reported to Caterpillar plant in Peoria, Illinois. The mornings we attended classes and toured the plant, and afternoons using the machinery at the proving grounds. There we played in the dirt with the biggest, newest, and heavy equipment. We were housed in Mennonite homes in Metamora, Illinois. At their church, we were told about the planned Trans-Chaco Highway. This road would go from Asuncion, the capital of Paraguay, to the Chaco, 250 miles. Mineral Colony was formed there in the early 1920s, coming from Canada. Fahrenheim Colony was formed by 1W World War I refugees, and Neuland Colony was refugees of World War II. All the colonies combined were about 20,000 people. The area they came to was called the Green Hell, inhabited by natives. To get their produce to Asuncion was by riverboat or in a narrow gauge railroad, which took about 1 week, or by a DC airplane. The road would be of great benefit. Building the Trans-Chaco Road was a unique endeavor. MCC would supply paxmen to operate equipment and trained Paraguayans to operate the equipment. We originally were 6 PAX fellows, and after a year it was increased that there would always be 12 PAX men there. U.S. foreign aid would supply heavy equipment: 12 scrapers, 2 motor graders, 4 bulldozers, fuel tanker, 2 jeeps, 2 service trucks, a drag line, power plant generator, and a line of other equipment. All were Army green, used the surplus from the Korean War, but unused. Paraguay would supply men who were in their army. They would also build the camps that we lived in as the road advanced. They cooked for us and we ate together. There were a few large cattle ranchers who would pay for the diesel fuel. The Paraguayan government gave their permission to build the road, and also American foreign aid supplied engineers. I think putting this program together, a lot of credit would go to 2 people, C.L. Graber from Illinois and Bill Snyder, who was at that time the MCC director. And I have read their account of how putting this together, and they said there were several times that they thought the whole project would fall apart in the planning. Harry Harder from Mountain Lake was our overall road foreman. He had knowledge of road building, knowledge of building roads and how to repair heavy equipment. I think Harry was our instructor, our teacher. Most of us were not familiar at all with road building, and he knew this, so he was so important in our program. Harry and his wife became also our parents for our time in Paraguay. Without Harry, I don't know if the project would have been accomplished. They stayed in Paraguay for the entire time the road was being built, which was about a little over 5 years. The road was a 2-foot high grade and 24 foot wide. We used clay dirt from borrow pits. No travel was possible after rain. Everyone had to wait until the roadbed dried. But 20 years later, the road was asphalted. The Chaco Mennonites are doing very well today, and much of this can be credited to the road. It changed the entire economy of the country. I believe building of the Chaco Road is one of MCC's better stories, success stories. I grew up in many ways during my 2 years I served in Paraguay. I came to know paciencia, patience, and mañana, tomorrow, in positive ways. I also came to view the world and our country as the haves and have-nots. My horizons were broadened by working with and living with guys from the different Mennonite denominations. Working with the Paraguayans was good. I'm grateful for the U.S. for accepting the work of alternative service, and thankful for U.S. foreign aid to poor countries. About 15 years ago, a well-done video was done by Mennonite media about the PAX story and some of their programs that we're involved with. So if anyone would be interested, you could speak to me.
I just wanted to add a little bit from the Korean War that Laverne talked about, and that is, I also what I want to say is during the Korean War, our pastor at Bethesda Mennonite Church in Henderson, Nebraska, was Arnold Neckel. Arnold Neckel was very influential in guiding our young men in their decisions during the time of war. This continued during the Vietnam War with Pastor John Geddert. I also remember that during the Korean War, during the war, a selective serviceman came to my father and asked the question about a neighbor, a young man who had applied for a CO classification. Apparently this was not unusual at that time during the Korean War. And yeah. But I served, I will tell you my story now, and that takes place during I did my 1W service, and my experience was from 1966 to 1968. But before I do, I need to explain how I arrived at the decision to participate in the program provided by the United States government for those who did not want to be a part of the military. I was brought up in the Mennonite family and attended Bethesda Mennonite Church in Henderson, Nebraska, where we were taught the principles of pacifism, the belief that it is never right to take part in war and nothing can justify killing a person deliberately. Although I didn't totally understand everything as I reached young adult, I considered myself a conscientious objector. In the 1960s, the United States draft was in place and the United States was at war with Vietnam. When you turned 18, you had to register with a selective service board so that you were available for military service. You were given then a 1A classification. The government also allowed and approved alternative service for those opposed to service in the military. The jobs available needed to make a meaningful contribution, which included health care, education, conservation, and others. The length of service was 24 months, equal to the time a man had to serve in the military. Since my belief, based on the teachings of Jesus, did not allow me to take the life of another human being, I appealed and requested a CO classification. But since I was in college, they, at that time, provided a 2S, which meant a deferment. As long as you were in college, you were deferred from military program. And so I got my 2S, and then in York County, Nebraska, where I grew up, you had to appeal in person to a local selective service board. What happened was, as soon as I did not return to college, I immediately received a 1A classification. So in York County, Nebraska, where I grew up, you had to appeal before a selective service board and explain to them why you should receive a CO classification. Even today, I would say that is one of the most difficult things I ever had to do. I still remember some of the questions I had to respond to in front of the Selective Service Board, such as, in what situation would you kill someone? What would you do if someone entered your home and threatened you and your family? If you don't believe in war, do you believe in the police force? And if so, what's the difference? Here I was sitting alone with men in authority, having a file of information concerning me, trying to explain my beliefs. I must have answered to their satisfaction. I did receive a CO classification. So a new chapter in my life was about to begin. Jeanette and I were married in December of '65 and moved to Denver, Colorado. I began my 1W service in January 12, 1966 at General Rose Memorial Hospital. This was a Jewish hospital. The hospital had 350 beds, and I worked in radiology. My work involved assisting patients to and from radiology, helping radiologists position patients for x-rays, working in the dark room developing films, and helping with preparation for various tests. One of the most difficult tasks was assisting with radiation treatment for cancer. I still recall my first patient that I took to radiation therapy, a man in his 30s, his back and legs so severely burned they were nearly black from radiation treatment. Remember, this was 60 years ago and much improvements have been made. One of the challenges of working in the hospital was meeting people and patients who had family members fighting in the war in Vietnam. I often felt inadequate in responding to questions, comments about any position about my position and what I was doing instead of being in the military. While I was at General Rose Hospital, the 1967 Six-Day Blitz War took place between Israel and the Arab states. Here I was, a CO during the Vietnam War, with people supporting the Blitz War in Israel. I remember overnight the hospital, this Jewish hospital, raised over $1 million to send to Israel to support the war. This was a time of many questions and discernments in my life. While we were in Denver, we visited several Mennonite churches and decided to become involved in the Arvada Mennonite Fellowship. While both of us came from larger congregations, this small fellowship of believers became our family and our support system. During the time in Denver, we were exposed to so many different ideas and faith traditions. We were young, but learned to take responsibility and grow in our faith. We were thankful for the support of our families, our home churches, and all the people that adopted us at our Arvada Mennonite Church. Now, as I reflect back on my decision to be a conscience objector and appearing before a selective service board, I understand that CO is so much more than opposing war. It is a whole life commitment and a challenging one. How do I conduct myself when I do business? How do I treat people I have disagreements with? What about capital punishment, abortion issues? I would like to think of CO meaning conscientiously objecting to the mistreating of any person. No doubt I still need to grow in my faith and the love of God for all people.
The U.S. has not had a draft since 1973. However, since the draft was canceled at that time, men ages 18 to 25 years old that live in the U.S. are still required to register with the Selective Service in case a draft is ever issued again. It is required by law, and it's a felony. If you don't, you can be punished with fines and whatnot, and possibly lose your citizenship or state-funded student financial aid if you choose to go to college. So when I was 19, I'm Austin Unruh, by the way, if you didn't know that. When I was 19, I picked up my registration from my local post office. I grew up in Gossel, Kansas, and sat down at the kitchen table to fill out my form. I'm not sure exactly why I waited until I was 19, but it is very possible that I was alerted that I needed to do this in order to keep my financial aid at Bethel College. When I was asked by Leroy to share as a part of this sharing time, I called my mom and asked if she knew any information or could help refresh my memory about the process, and she was able to send me a picture of my original form that I signed, and apparently there was a carbon copy that I was able to file away, and she still had it and sent me a picture of it. And it confirmed what I remembered about the process. It was very simple. I remember filling out my name, my address, my social security number, and the date, and signed it. And that's pretty much all it was. Nowhere on that form was there any spot to recognize that if a draft would happen, that I would be a conscientious objector. So, at the direction of my parents, I wrote in red ink, in between every line and all over the form, that I am a conscientious objector. Additionally, I remember writing a brief statement testifying to my faith in Jesus and my belief that as a Mennonite, I am called to follow the peaceful leading of Christ in resolving conflict in nonviolent ways. Unfortunately, this statement was not in the folder with the original copy, and I did some searching on old hard drives and went back as far as I could go and could not come up with anything that was saved on a computer. So it's possible that I actually handwrote this statement as well and never made a copy. I grew up in a Mennonite household in rural Gossel, Kansas, and attended Alexanderville Mennonite Church up until my time moving with my wife, Lindsay, formerly Ortman, now Unruh, to this community in 2014. During my time growing up and learning in the church, peace in opposition to violence and war was woven into the very fabric and framework of my learning in the church and my upbringing at home. I cannot remember any specific conversations led by my church, Sunday school, youth pastor, or in catechism class about the act of being a conscientious objector and what it would mean if a draft were enacted. My knowledge was limited to however much I paid attention to the stories of the older generations in church through days like today, or how much of my assigned reading for catechism class I chose to actually read. But for my parents, who would have been just young enough to fall in the same boat as me as never having to go through the draft, the concept of being a conscientious objector was much more personal to them. Both of their parents, my grandparents, were granted to stay home and operate their farms during the Vietnam War. But others in the church and community, just like the stories you've heard today, served in various forms of alternative service. All that said, the church and the community and my family all supported and will continue to support the act of making a peace statement and indicating the stance of objecting to war as a method of conflict resolution. When I was asked by Leroy to share my experience as a post-draft young man, I remember telling him, of course, but I won't have that much to share about compared to others. And I do feel like small peanuts standing up here compared to the stories and the experiences of others. I haven't had to make any drastic life change or go serve in any capacity by force or against my will. However, I do feel that just because I've not been asked to do this or to take a public stance to show my belief in the peace of Christ, this doesn't mean I'm not called to be a peace seeker in my daily life. And upon reflection, I find that I do have things to share, and just maybe not as dramatic or life-altering as stories of others. I've always felt called to lead by example in my words and deeds, portraying my love of Christ by being the light and peace of Jesus to the world around me. This hasn't come from my own self-ambition alone, but rather at the example of my loving and peace-seeking family and forebears. I think especially of my grandfather, Harvey Schmidt, my mom's dad, who received a deferment to run the family dairy farm in Kansas. Following the Vietnam War, Harvey accompanied the first delivery of wheat through MCC to Vietnam post-war, some of which was grown on the Schmidt farm in Kansas. My parents instilled in me the importance of peace and cultured an environment that was free from many of the mainstream violent media that seems to surround us at all time. I've had many unique opportunities to put my faith and belief in peace to action between my time playing football in high school and playing at college, at Bethel College, and continuing to be in the sport of football as a coach now, a sport that has maintained widespread close ties to the military and militaristic concepts, and being surrounded by athletes from all walks of life. Teaching high school math and coaching has also challenged me to continue to be the hands and feet of Christ in my work with high school students and athletes. In rural South Dakota, the National Guard has a large presence in many high schools, and Freeman is no different, and this has challenged me to explain my beliefs, and hopefully my daily interactions portray the love, peace, and the acceptance of others that I cherish. Where do I sense God is leading us as a church, though, in regards to taking a position of peace? I think it is so important for our young adults and youth to hear these stories of having to put our beliefs to the test and to make sacrifices for our peace stance. But also, I think it is important for us as a church to explain what it means to be a conscientious objector and the history behind that choice. But almost of more importance to me is to teach and show why we believe in peace and nonviolence as a means of conflict resolution. Between TV, movie, video games, social media, and even thinking about, with my young boys, to toys and kids media, tolerance of violence and the mainstreamness of violence in our various forms surrounds us, from superhero culture, first-person shooter video games, the polarizing nature of us versus them on seemingly any issue, or the ease in which violent images and words can be shared on social media platforms. Peace is needed today just as much as it was yesterday, and as much as it will be tomorrow.
Thank you, gentlemen. You did great. We got through that. I thought we were going to be here a lot longer, so. I asked Gail Priam if he could possibly be here this weekend. Gail grew up in this church, and he served in Vietnam in an alternative program at the height of the Vietnam War. So I asked him to send me a written account of his time and his experiences about that. So this is what he sent me. So why would an old man who was well into the third of his life sit down and write about a 3-year period of time which took place early in the first third of his life? Great question, but one I cannot answer definitively at this time. I do, however, think it has something to do with the fact that at this time in life there seems to be a need to close the loop and to bring closure to certain experiences in our lives. Maybe that reason is in there somewhere. My ancestor emigrated from Ukraine to the plains of South Dakota in 1874. This was just another move for these Mennonites who had a history of fleeing governments who disallowed the practice of conscientious objection to participation in war. They were farmers who were attracted to the tall, warm season grasses that waved in the summer breezes in the southeastern part of the state. To them, tall grass signified fertile soil, and this became their new home. By the turn of the century, this small Mennonite community near Freeman had established churches, medical services, schools, and a junior college. Bible classes were required at Freeman Academy. We studied Mennonite history and our Anabaptist heritage. In Sunday school at church, we were taught that killing and violence is not a way to settle deeply held differences of opinion, that participating in war is wrong. These teachings were reinforced in my home, and we were taught that pacifism and love of all was to be a way of life, of all our lives. This close-knit community was the foundation of my upbringing. After graduating from Freeman Junior College, my twin brother Lyle and I parted ways to finish our bachelor's degrees at different colleges. I attended Bluffton College in Ohio. By 1964 to 66, when I was at Bluffton, the American military troop buildup in Vietnam was in full swing. I had hoped to go for a Master's of Social Work degree at Michigan State University after graduation, but realized that I would most likely be drafted out of graduate school. I contacted Mennonite Central Committee, a relief and community development organization administered by the larger Mennonite Church. They were an alternative service organization sanctioned by the U.S. government to place draft-eligible young men and women in civilian service programs in lieu of military service. They agreed to search for an alternative service placement for me. I had requested a placement in a mental hospital or some similar assignment in keeping with my vocational interests. By early 1966, the year of my graduation, I did not have a placement. I was concerned. I did not know how to plan my future. I was involved in a fairly serious relationship with a young woman who was also a student at Bluffton. Should she and I plan a future together? What if I didn't have a placement when the draft board decided to call me? What would I tell the draft board regarding an assignment if I needed to appear before them to present my rationale for requesting conscientious objector status? One day in the last semester of school, I received a phone call from MCC. They informed me that they were collaborating with Church World Service and Lutheran World Relief to form Vietnam Christian Service, to provide services in Vietnam during the war. Would I be interested in going there for 3 years? And would they like to have they would like to have my response in 2 weeks. I remember having the feeling that my world was suddenly closing in on me. How was I to go to classes and function with this huge decision to make? What did it mean for me and Louise? How would my parents and family feel about me going off for 3 years with no visits during that time? And what about the danger factor? I was leaning towards accepting MCC's offer, but I knew I needed to talk to my parents about this decision. We talked on the phone. To my relief, they said that I was an adult now and it was my decision to make, and they registered their apprehension about seeing their son voluntarily go to a country at war. They understood that this was based upon a deeply held value that they had instilled in me while growing up at home. The next day, I called MCC and accepted their assignment. I was to report to Akron, Pennsylvania in late August for orientation to a 3-year service assignment with Vietnam Christian Service in South Vietnam. A new group of volunteers descended in Akron, Pennsylvania in September of 1966. Anticipation and anxiety merged into a bundle of nerves for our young group of volunteers. We were headed to different corners of the world for 2.5 to 3-year assignments, depending on our destination. I and 3 other young men, all Quakers, all graduates from George Fox University, were headed to Vietnam together after completion of orientation a week later. Then one day, during our week-long orientation, a letter came for me. It was from Mom. I look at the letter now, written in Mom's beautiful handwriting, and this is what she said. September 1, 1966, Dear Gail, I should have gotten up and written this letter right away. That night I lay awake in the bright moonlight, composing one to you. Now I don't remember all the phrases I had put together. I remember the story I had saved in the cedar chest so long ago until that day should have come in my life. I'm sending it along. It's a good portrayal of a mother's feelings. There were so many things one could have said these last weeks and days, but it was easier to talk glibly of trivial things to cover up the emotions which lay so near the surface. So I'm just writing this letter to say that we love you dearly and find it hard to give you up to serving in a place so fraught with danger. And yet, we are deeply thankful that you have the compulsion to do this work of relief, which the Christian Church has a mission to do. And we know God will bless you in it. There comes to my mind the phrase of Noreen's prayer Sunday morning. Noreen is Gail's sister. That you may have no fear in the face of danger. Your motto these 3 years should be Philippians 1:21. For me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Then we'd lightly say, when you come back in 3 years, we'll do this or we'll do that. There was underneath an ache of an if. But we realized the loss would only be yours, it would be ours as much as yours. I told Dad about your request not to bring your body back in case something happens. And he said, we would have to respect your wishes. So having cleared the air, let's look ahead now to new anticipation, to new experiences, new adventures, new friendships, and the comfort of God's presence and guidance with all my love. Your Mom. Didn't know if I was going to get through that. And Gail concludes by saying, I was deeply touched by this letter. It also occurred to me that some version of a letter with these sentiments was probably being penned by thousands of mothers all over the world who were sending their young sons and daughters into harm's way. The cycle of life tugs at the bonds of family circles as families disperse into their own personal endeavors. So thank all of you again. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate everybody who participated and who was attending here this morning. I would just like to make one quick announcement before we leave. A few weeks ago, Nathan Epp gave a presentation at North Church on Mennonite history and Mennonite Anabaptist history and theology. And we've asked him to come and make that presentation here at South Church as well. So he's going to do that during the Sunday school hour 2 weeks from today on August 4th. So invite you back for that. Thank you.